is half a point outside top 8. Only half a point. And here we go.
Here we go. It's a queen's pawn opening. Magnus pushing that pawn forward. He hasn't been experimenting too much with the weird and wacky openings throughout this tournament. I wonder what Magnus will do here. Will it be a queen's gambit? Will it be the London system to do play openings that my opponents are special in? But OK, London calling, it is the London system. You're right, Jovanka. Has Magnus done his homework here? Because Gukesh, we saw him in the Gelfand Challenge. He won the final round, the crucial game. He has a large choice, and he brings his bishop out. I guess normal would have been to push some pawns, but instead he brings his bishop out. That tends to be a bad bishop, sometimes locked behind its own pawns. How do you think he's going to do that, Jovanka? What's he done in the past? He develops his bishop. I thought he was going to push a pawn there. You thought knight, I thought pawn. He played bishop.
He played bishop.
And there we do see a trade of bishops early on.
You can put your knight into the centre and then you can start attacking.
More respected. And Magnus had the opportunity to grab a pawn there and he didn't go for it. You don't want to give young players any energy in their position. You don't want to give them something to hope for. Black a pawn down, but with a nice active rook. Gukesh playing quickly so far. That's the key for him, I think. OK, he does play pawn takes pawn. That's just Magnus's style. He doesn't want things to get blocked up too congested. He wants a clear plan. And now after the bishop recaptures, which I expect, then white might castle. And then he'll use his own pawns to undermine black's strong centre. OK, and meanwhile, we do have a decision on this critical moment by Gukesh. He doesn't recapture his pawn. He just brings his knight out, saying to Magnus, OK, you're a pawn up, but it's only temporary. Gukesh really posing questions to the world champion at this early stage.
And since the Fallujah Huifang game finally finished, we now have the standings. Can I take the standings, or should we address this move?
So Magnus trying to defend his pawn and going on the attack with his queen, but there are consequences. In previous tour events, in the 6 previous events, 8.5 tends to be completely safe. 8.5 out of 15. So with 3 games left, 8.5, you're very happy. Not showing any fear. And getting some great wins along the way. Meanwhile, black is still a pawn down, though, on this board, and Magnus has developed his knight. It's not actually easy to win back that pawn. If we just bring up that analysis board, we see that white's extra pawn, it is a doubled pawn. These 2 pawns on the C-line kind of get in each other's way. And right now, this is a bit of a lone ranger. It's only defended by white's queen. And look at this, Gukesh, he's pushing a pawn forward, trying to eliminate the defender of this pawn. But if Magnus wants to cling to it, he can step forward. The bishop's... OK, he does that. He still can't take this pawn, this bishop. This bishop is dreaming of taking this pawn, but it can't quite yet. And now there's 2 ways that I see to try and maybe regain this pawn. The most tempting, though, is to actually drop back with the black queen to create this square. And white has to be careful as well. OK, he finds the best move, I think, there, Gukesh.
Yeah.
He is so impressive, this teenager. And white has to be careful. If you push a pawn forward to try and defend your pawns, watch out. You might actually, maybe not this move immediately, but yeah, actually here, you're just about to get your queen trapped. You can maybe try and exchange queens and beg and hope that you're OK, but Magnus, he has to be careful himself.
Like, what's going to happen? Like, I mean, if you just try to move your knight to the edge of the board.
Oh, he does it.
And it happens.
But Gukesh is just going to retreat.
Right.
The queen only has 1 safe square now.
That's the only square.
And then she's going to... Well, Gukesh is going to take this pawn. I actually really like Gukesh's position. If he retreats his knight, as he does. So he cleared that square for his knight last move with that queen retreat. That queen retreat was very impressive because...
No, he steps forward, David.
Okay. Magnus finds a different square. He offers a queen trade, but that doesn't look ambitious at all.
I mentally reversed the position round. Plan, I see. It's a very subtle plan.
Okay.
But it's definitely something that usually you do with colours reversed when you have the black side of things. There is this happening.
It's almost the same.
Almost the same.
Almost identical. Instead, Gukesh traded the queens and then he went with the bishop to capture here. That white is going to lack space later in the endgame.
And I like the fact that he did it. He kept the 2 knights on the board because, you know, again, it's another case in point for the 2 of a kind.
Do you know he's fond of going for those quick draws, and it looks like Fallujah.
Against Huifang. Black against Wesley So is probably one of the toughest pairings in the tournament for sure. So Fallujah playing safety first there. And I really like what Gukesh has done. He's pushing pawns on the left side. He's now pushed a pawn on the other side, getting ready to kind of use a square for the black king. All these kind of small factors again, but it is all in Black's favour. And that last move by Magnus shows that he's on the defensive.
One fine day, perhaps pushing... This was the sneaky idea that I had in mind. So the whole idea with manoeuvring the knight to this particular square is that perhaps you can push a pawn on the left side of the board, 1 square, and then, oh no, he wants to make a use of his bishop.
Yeah. I think,
Make a square.
Yeah, Magnus should not touch any pawns on that left side. You shouldn't play pawns on the side that you're weaker. That's where black's knights lie. I think that would only maybe create weaknesses and help push you to that next level. But I know a lot of young kids nowadays, they say, oh, this looks like a +1 position, but that means nothing. +1 can mean 10 different things, and that's not how you should learn the game.
When Magnus just had the centre and was just very comfortable with absolutely everything. And just look at this very nice move by Gukesh, just calmly pushing a pawn.
Yeah. OK, Magnus forced into passivity. He's just moving a rook, just creating some space for his other rook to use some squares. But yeah, that's not an active move
that's
at all.
That's a little bit. That's the kind of move where your spider senses start to tingle, and you think, "Ooh, are there any forcing moves?" Because I'm just looking at the pattern of that position. I'm like, the rook and the king, that's vulnerable to a knight fork. So if I were to clear the path, maybe something could happen.
Yeah, and now Magnus has found a good square for his other rook at least. But you're right, Jovanka, that white rook on the C line, it looks awfully shaky. It's not defended, and that's when your radar, your spidey senses start tingling when there are undefended pieces in your opponent's camp. And OK, Gukesh, he's starting to up the speed at least on the clock. His last few moves have been kind of vague moves, pushing Harry the H-pawn up a couple of squares, taking space, now bringing his king towards the centre. No immediate breakthrough, no immediate plan, but just following that decent strategy of improving pieces. And, OK, we do hear a move. Wow, yeah, that just shows that Magnus, he has no plan. He brought his rook to the centre on a semi-open line. Nothing to do there. He's brought it back. Frank, on that fifth row, all of them, is he going to continue stepping forward with pawns? OK, now he's pushing a different pawn. That's a committal, but it does make some sense. He's trying to box in White's dark square bishop, so he's putting pawns to light squares.
Instantly capturing that pawn. I perhaps would have taken some time over that capture.
Tarash, who said that weak squares in your opponent's camp should be occupied by pieces, not pawns, and that's what Gukesh will try to do. Magnus cannot sit still any longer. He has to take some action.
Yeah. Key issue in the position, because like David says, White is threatening to capture the pawn. And now, once the black knight moves, well, the protection over the central pawn has been released. So now Gukesh has to be incredibly accurate. And I think this is definitely the best move on the board. Because now knight takes pawn isn't really possible, because maybe you can now get in your tactics.
I think it might still be possible. It's super sharp. Maybe if we can just get the board very quickly while keeping an eye on the players. And here, White has a choice. White can take this pawn. It looks like it's a free pawn, but you have to calculate well, and he has done it, Magnus Carlsen.
OK, so we're going to see it.
OK, knight takes pawn here. In an ideal world, Black would have dropped his knight in, giving check, and suddenly winning this white rook afterwards. But the problem is, after king takes knight, this bishop is suddenly defended by its knight, and White would actually win here because he has two pieces for a rook. So instead, Gukesh finding the best move. He keeps finding the best moves. He just takes this pawn, and now these rooks are looking at each other. Black's rooks threatening to invade. When both sides are down to 1 minute... OK, he trades rooks. Both sides are down to 1 minute. Knights are the trickiest, most annoying pieces in the world. Brings his rook down and checks you.
I would block it with my knight.
Ooh, but then I can... OK.
Can you do something?
Yeah, maybe. Now, he's the one asking questions of Gukesh.
OK, it's actually on the board. OK, and...
I was slightly concerned that...
Oh, dear.
We're heading straight down the variation we were discussing. So White's pieces now really hanging together by a thread.
3 seconds.
Critical moment.
Ian, he's gone for it. Knight takes bishop, and then rook takes knight.
But now White is completely safe, I think.
Yeah, I would actually prefer to be White, because suddenly I'm going to be a pawn up. I'm a little bit surprised by that move. I was expecting maybe something else, but OK, rook takes pawn. OK, and... yeah, now he gets behind the furthest pawn and attacks that one. The thing is, though, that your knight does get caught offside once you start chasing those pawns on the edge of the board. So, OK, well, do you think Magnus is just simply looking for some series of checks?
I still think Magnus would love a draw right now. White's pawns are too... they're just...
They're so backward, aren't they? They're so uncoordinated, and there's just no way to kind of get them motoring. And look at the white knight.
Yes, awkward pin for that white knight. Paralysed right now, cannot move. Magnus gives a check. He's hoping for the draw here. Look at Magnus's body language. He knows he's been in trouble this game. OK, Gukesh allows a repetition of the position for the first time. Will he play for the win, Gukesh? Can he find a way to put Magnus under pressure? Or will he just allow these checks? Will he take the draw? Magnus is kind of silently offering him this draw now with all these checks. Can the king find a different route?
With the clock ticking down, I think he's just going to panic and go into the draw. What do you think, David?
Probably I would do the same, but we would love to see him fight, and he doesn't repeat the position. Decision, though. I would have gone the other way, maybe, with the king, if anywhere. And now
there's a threat in the air. There's a threat in the air that black is threatening. Rook takes knight. OK, but Magnus has spotted that.
That is pinned. I think the white king can actually step forward now. And now the black knight is attacked. 2 seconds for Gukesh. OK, he made that move with 3 seconds on his clock.
Yeah, lovely pin there by Magnus.
OK, so now Magnus is a pawn up, but it should still be a draw. 3 versus 2. Gukesh, he needs to get active with the black king. He needs to make sure... OK, he finds that move. He needs to make sure Magnus doesn't work that endgame magic.
4 seconds left on the clock.
It's definitely not easy for him to hold this draw anymore. The longer that Magnus can kind of nurse that, he now goes active with his rook. The longer this doesn't change, the more Gukesh will get nervous. Also the clock situation. OK, he attacks a pawn. White's rook is just going to check that black king away. And that black king will be forced to retreat.
All right, and with the clock situation, I'm getting nervous for Gukesh here.
Instead, now he's forced to defend, and White's king going active. Yeah, sometimes you're dead winning. 1 move later, you're forced to defend a horrible endgame. How can White make progress? How can White try and win this game? OK, he gives check.
And now pawn takes. Yeah, it's not that easy for White to make progress now that the black king has nicely centralised itself and is in prime position to defend its pawn.
Kind of take revenge for all that suffering he had earlier in the game, because then White's rook will go after the black pawn. So the black king has to stay near its own pawn.
Pawn that White has, the pawn on the G line, that is actually quite a terrible pawn to have. It's the central pawn that you want to keep. Just an easy, eyes closed draw.
Yeah, no way to win if it's just a G pawn alone for White. White's king's pawn on the E line, that is the potential winner for White. White's central pawn, the passed pawn. Okay,
that's a nice move. But OK, you still have rook check now. We need a few stages, right? So first of all, Magnus improves the rook so that the rook can give cover if needed.
I think the best endgame players, they know when to accelerate the play, but when to just kind of take a time out and just slowly improve or slowly wait till endgame down a pawn, down a pass pawn when your opponent's king is active.
Okay, the king has made its bid for freedom. OK, so now we're expecting, well, how to check.
Okay.
Well, Gukesh chooses to check from behind, but Magnus just blocks it from the side.
Yeah. I'm going to check you from the side. And rook endgames, we talk about checking distance sometimes. You always want at least 3 rows between your rook and the opponent's king, so the opponent can't run towards your rook. It's harder for your opponent to block. And here, Gukesh, perfectly. This is impressive endgame technique by the youngster. Magnus, he's trying all these different techniques. They're not quite working yet, no breakthrough. Gukesh giving check there. If the white king steps forward, he'll continue checking.
Yeah,
from the side.
Exactly. It's so important. You can check from behind, but you also got to remember check from the side. And Magnus stepping backwards with the king. Well, Magnus really not making any progress, largely thanks to Gukesh's amazing defence.
This is tenacious stuff from the teenager. And Magnus, again, just making moves. No immediate plan. I think he's just trying to gain a bit of time on the clock. Look at Magnus. He's up to almost 2 minutes. Earlier, he was under 1 minute. So he's just going to try and maybe get 3-4 minutes on the clock and then find a plan. But it does mean Gukesh is going to gain time as well.
Yeah. Actually, I was told that it's some grandmaster's strategy that you make nonsense moves. You don't non-moves.
Confuse your opponent.
And lull your opponent into a false sense of danger, and then you set the trap.
Yeah, and Magnus will set a trap at some point if he can, but right now, still no progress. The white rook dancing around the black king, stepping forward, and yep. OK, finally, there's a move. There's a pawn move, a pawn push, a hot streak.
Yeah, very cool.
And, OK, the black king stepping forward.
Magnificent so far. Absolutely. He makes it look so easy. OK, but here's a decision.
Rook is always going to threaten to check the white king from behind or from the side. You can always give it up if you need to. So, OK, white's rook does continue checking the black king. No progress here at all for Magnus Carlsen. Gukesh, how calm is he? Like, I mean, especially after just the path of the game, just the general trend, it all was in his favour. Suddenly turned against him, but he has adapted immediately onto the defensive task. Gukesh refusing to back down.
And I have to say, one of the dangers with white advancing their pawn in the middle too far up the board is that the pawn actually gives the white king some shelter from some of the checks.
Pawn if you really want to, but yeah, check makes sense. And another check. Right now, I mean, I don't see any reason not to give a check. OK, he doesn't go for the safest option. He goes for a pawn, but Magnus says, I'm going to give up that pawn. And OK, now it's a bit of a race. White's king going active, trying to support its passed pawn. So white taking some risk, but black can just bring his rook behind that pawn, I think. And black now will have his own trump card. His own pawn will start running as well. So still within the realms of a draw.
Yeah, definitely. And the black rook will now get behind the white pawn.
He'll delay it as long as possible. He'll happily give up his rook for white's pawn. And the black king and pawn together will march down the board. So, yep, when in doubt, give a check. Gukesh does that.
We actually had a draw like that, didn't we, David?
Yeah, long time ago.
It was a long time ago.
Now, black just needs to keep checking. OK, he doesn't do that. He doesn't need to do that. He pushes a pawn. And it's going to be too slow for white. White's going to push his pawn. Black's king's going to step forward now to support its pawn. And then black will just give up his rook. Happily. Yeah, right. Both pawns are going to cost the opponent their rooks. And we'll end up with king versus king in that one.
Ooh, Magnus trying to be sneaky here. He's inviting.
Actually, even rook takes rook would be a draw there, but you definitely don't want to allow your opponent to make a queen.
Do that one. Well, no.
So Gukesh just keeping his rook for now, not getting distracted away from the white pawn. And yeah, I think we'll see a draw within the next minute or so.
OK, here it comes.
Next 20 seconds or so.
Exactly. Rook takes, and now the pawn will start advancing. And just look, the white king is just helpless to...
It's off in Siberia somewhere.
Exactly, you know, and the action is happening on the right. And the white rook cannot fend off both the king and the pawn. So there you go. King versus king.
Gukesh.
What is that reaction about?
I think he's unhappy. I think he knew he had a big advantage.
Wow.
And, or maybe he's just shattered after such an exhausting game. But
it's an important point. It's an important...